All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to tonight's program, Increasing LGBTQ plus Representation in the STEM Community. This is C2ST's first panel in over 18 months, so thank you so much for coming in person. And thank you so much for everyone who is joining us online as well. My name is Trevor Rayhans. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm so excited to be here. I work in corporate communications at Horizon Therapeutics, who is proudly sponsoring and supporting this event. I also support diversity, equity, and inclusion communications there. So in partnership with the Association for Women in Science, Chicago, and Northwestern's Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Wellbeing, tonight's program is presented to you by the Chicago Council on Science and Technology. For those of you that are new to Chicago Council on Science Technology, C2ST is a 15-year-old not-for-profit that seeks to inspire and engage all segments of society about science and technology and their contributions to society. C2ST hosts about 30 free programs throughout the year on current STEM topics. You can sign up to receive updates on upcoming programs at c2st.org, or as you all that are in person at the table in the atrium, you can sign up there as well. So as for housekeeping, out of abundance of caution and following local guidelines, as well as Northwestern's policies to reiterate the wearing of masks when those are not at the podium, as well as not eating or drinking in the hall. Please enjoy the refreshments we have available, but no food or drinks are allowed in the auditorium. As for questions, please use the conference app to ask questions by typing c2st2.cnf.io, for those in the room, that's over there as well, into your phone browser. Throughout the talk, you can ask questions anonymously, upvote questions you'd like, check speaker profiles, and evaluate the program at the end. So please take note of that. Our moderator will read all those questions from the app and ask appropriate panelists questions. So please turn down your cell phones, obviously, but we encourage you to take pictures and post and live tweet throughout the event and ask questions. And I would go ahead and like to introduce our keynote. So our keynote tonight is speaker Dr. Luis A. Leyva, an assistant professor of mathematics education at Vanderbilt University, Peabody College of Education and Human Development. He is presently completing a 2020-2021 postdoctoral fellowship with the National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation, conducting educational research on the lived experiences of undergraduate Black and Latin LGBTQ+ students pursuing STEM majors at minority-serving and historically white universities in the United States. Before his faculty career, Leyva worked for over 6 years in numerous higher education initiatives for supporting underrepresented populations in STEM, including living learning communities, summer bridge programs, and first-year seminar experiences. So please give me a warm welcome in introducing Dr.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you so much for having me. I think I'm ready to share my first slide. Great. Hi, everybody. Good evening. This is the title for my presentation. Before I engage with today's topic, I always acknowledge my own positionality and how I position myself in relation to this work. And so tonight I'm going to be sharing some perspectives with you around some of my work focused on the lived experiences of undergraduate LGBTQ students of color, specifically queer and trans students of color pursuing STEM majors. And so for me, I acknowledge my own identities and the ways in which I'm positioned in relation to systems of anti-Blackness, in relation to cis heteropatriarchy, so as a white, potentially white passing Latin cisgender male. In relation to those systems of oppression and privilege, I recognize that there are certain ways in which I'm positioned in ways that position me in a place of privilege. But at the same time, as a queer identifying Latin man who is the son of Cuban immigrants to this country, who have supported me through their work, working different kinds of custodial jobs over the years, I also recognize the different ways in which my intersecting identity place me in unique forms of oppression and marginalization in society and in relation to STEM. And so in my work, I constantly engage in actionable ways in terms of being in community through writing and reading groups, being in a research lab that's intentionally, along with the writing and reading groups, being intentionally diverse in terms of race, gender, sexual identity, and other forms of difference, to be able to do this work in solidarity, because I alone can't necessarily do all of this and have all those perspectives. I will say that there is a slight echo coming back. I'm going to continue presenting. And so before I share today's, oh, there's a significant echo. I'm sorry. Well, I think it's still going. I guess I'm going to try to keep going. So I want to recognize the land and indigenous lands that I'm at. Currently, I'm in Nashville, Tennessee, so I recognize the Yuchi, the Shawnee, and the East Cherokee lands that I'm on. My work really stems from, the echo is gone. I hope you can still hear me. And so my work really is situated in STEM higher education and undergraduate STEM. But I know that you all who are in the audience tonight are coming from different perspectives and different roles. And so I encourage you to think about the transferability of some of the perspectives that I share with you tonight, of how different perspectives that I'll be sharing can relate to your own respective roles in supporting students who identify as LGBTQ in schools, in college campuses, and in the community. So I'd like to acknowledge first the individuals who made this happen this evening. I'd also like to recognize the support of the National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation, Vanderbilt University, Peabody College, and the LGBTQ Policy Lab at Vanderbilt that provided generous funding for this work. Also, in addition to the research participants for their time and shared perspectives in doing this work to be able to transform the state of STEM education. As I mentioned before, I can't do this work alone, and so at Vanderbilt, I direct a research lab called Prism, which stands for Power, Resistance, and Identity in STEM Education. And these are the faces of the amazing minds that are in the Prism Lab. And so we have weekly to bi-weekly meetings, depending on the semester, where we come together to engage in collective thinking, but also the space is not just a space of productivity, but it's also a space of intergenerational forms of support and healing. And we come through this from our different walks and different perspectives on life to be able to inform the work, to be able to interrogate interlocking systems of oppression in STEM higher education. So I acknowledge the work of my colleagues through Prism. To situate this work for this evening, I'd like to recognize some of the work on which I'm building on in the literature in undergraduate education. And so in the research, we understand that systems of racism and cis heteropatriarchy shape STEM educational spaces and STEM spaces more broadly in ways in which students who are underrepresented or minoritized across different social differences are oftentimes positioned as being less competent or able. So when you think about racial hierarchies of ability that position white and Asian identifying individuals as being more innately competent than their Black and Latin counterparts, or that being LGBTQ may not necessarily be relevant, or is an indicator of being less successful in being in STEM. And so the literature has looked at some of these issues through an intersectional lens of how notions of anti-Black racism and cis heteropatriarchy shape these different lived experiences. By and large, it has focused mainly around race and gender. And when you look at issues around specifically for LGBTQ students of color, the literature is quite scant. And in addition to it not existing, I would argue that being able to center the voices of queer and trans students of color can really help us to illuminate and push back on the broader systems to give us a really more robust understanding of how individuals who may identify differently are also navigating these spaces as well. And so the ways in which these individuals are positioned in deficit ways is oftentimes justified by the ways in which we construct STEM curricula to be neutral. And oftentimes this neutrality is actually undergirded by ideologies of whiteness. So when you think about colorblind racism, or when you think about in relation to cis heteropatriarchy, notions of gender blindness, that basically right away structural inequalities and attribute lack of success to it being an individual deficit. So we remove the structural realities of what's shaping these inequities, right? And pin it more on individuals just innately lacking ability. And so what ends up happening is when students are in these classroom spaces and they're engaging with curricula in neutral ways, they don't have opportunities to really see themselves or have heightened sense of not trying to engage their identity in these spaces, right? And so what ends up happening is in the literature in higher education that has focused on queer and trans students of color, there is this kind of dualism happening around explicit forms of discrimination, but at the same time feeling invisible. And I would argue that this is something that you also see in the context of STEM education. And so I think by being able to kind of disrupt this sense of neutrality, which is a really central piece of what I'm going to talk about with you today around pedagogical practices and really disrupting pedagogical practices that are beholden to the sense of neutrality in STEM, we make space for issues and perspectives from queer and trans students of color or queer and trans people of color broadly, to be able to, going back to the theme for tonight, how are we increasing representation, right? So how are we creating identity affirming learning opportunities for students to be able to persist in STEM? So over the years, and continuing on, because I'm still doing this work, I've been focusing recently on my work around the experiences of undergraduate queer and trans students of color in STEM. And this is across two research studies that were funded. One was a single institution case study that then was expanded into a multi-institutional case study with the support of the National Academy of Education and Spencer Foundation that looks across the experiences of queer and trans students of color in STEM, specifically across all these institutions, 40 Black, Latin, and Asian queer students in those majors. And these institutions varied in terms of their national recognition for LGBTQ support, programmatic initiatives for supporting racially underrepresented students in STEM, and also variation types of institutions in the communities that they're serving. So some of the institutions were historically white, and some were also minority serving. So for example, a Hispanic serving institution. And in my work, in terms of my data collection, students who are participating in this work will often submit at first a STEM autobiography to just tell me a little bit about who they are in relation to STEM. And then they engage throughout the project in what's called event journaling, which is a process in which students who are in this work are taking stock of positive and negative moments in relation to their social identities as STEM majors, and how those moments, they're reflecting on them in terms of how they were affirming of their social identities or how they were disaffirming of those social identities. And then collectively, we engage in individual and group interviews to be able to unpack these moments and their broader realities to really understand in a more nuanced way the ways in which they're experiencing STEM education, not only as a space of marginalization, because my work, while it interrogates and addresses that, my work also highlights forms of resistance and agency to be able to kind of move away from this hapless victim kind of narrative that we oftentimes see in relation to justice work, but also spotlighting the ways in which individuals, and in my case, queer and trans people of color, are finding their ways to be successful and being able to resist these broader forces. And so my work has unfolded into developing a framework, the white cis heteropatriarchal framework of STEM education, that accounts for different levels of forces and influences that shape queer and trans students of color's experiences in STEM. And so, and this is actually undergirded by tenets of queer critical race theory that really takes a queer specific lens of looking at the realities of structural racism, as well as queer of color critique and queer of color analyses. So thinking about the work of Ferguson and Brockenbrough and other colleagues who are engaged in really understanding the queer of color lived experiences of students, specifically for me in the education side of things, of looking at this in relation to campus spaces and classroom spaces. And so this framework that I've been able to develop through my research has really revealed these different levels of influences. So at the ideological level, the ways in which broader beliefs and values about STEM So the notions of it, for example, meritocracy, where it's just about how hard you work. Going back to that piece earlier about the neutrality piece, where we really remove structural realities of oppression and just pin it on individual effort. Institutional influences. So the ways in which practices and structures within classroom spaces, departmental spaces, are shaping the ways in which STEM achievement and participation are accessible to students. And then at the relational level, how are students engaging in the everyday experiences of oppression and resistance while they're navigating these broader realities? And so these, while I have 3 dimensions here, these are all interrelated to one another and work in tandem with one another. And for my presentation today, I'm actually going to give you a glimpse into each of these dimensions in relation to pedagogical practices that we can think through together of being more supportive and affirming of queer and trans students of color. And so at the ideological level, you can consider opportunities of disrupting forms of curricular erasure. So in our curriculum, many students in my work talk about how they oftentimes don't see themselves reflected in the curriculum. But there are individuals who are part of various different professional organizations and in STEM fields broadly who identify and hold these intersectional identities. And so are there ways that we can think about incorporating those perspectives or those contributions into the curriculum? And one thing I will say is it's important to do this in a way that's not necessarily not integrated meaningfully. It has to be in the culture of your curriculum, because if we engage it in a really kind of disconnected way, it can run the risk of it kind of us engaging in some form of tokenization of queer of color people in STEM fields. So the ways in which you incorporate this has to be done in meaningful ways in your curriculum. And so I highlight Spectra, which is one professional organization in mathematics of LGBTQ plus mathematicians, where you might be able to learn about the work of LGBTQ of color mathematicians and be able to find opportunities that are meaningful, have meaningful synergies with the topics that you're engaging in with your classes or in your own areas of educational work. Many students talk about having justice-oriented motivations to pursue STEM, but oftentimes they don't see this reflected in the curriculum. And so many times students will talk about issues of trying to grapple with climate change or notions of providing more equitable access to trans people of color. But the ways in which STEM curricula gets designed is it's not engaging in those important issues. And so much of that kind of justice-oriented drive that they might have oftentimes gets lost in terms of their own career pursuits. And so what are ways in which we're being able to think about and reimagine the curriculum to think about some of these issues? So I highlighted here from Sustain US a blog post that was written by Philip Brown, who was a queer, non-binary femme immigrant from Jamaica, Kingston, Jamaica, who talks about their experiences of being able to think about how issues around climate change in Jamaica really kind of inspired their ways of advocating for change in the United States. So when you think about the ways in which LGBTQ students, including LGBTQ students of color, are oftentimes displaced from their homes, and the ways in which climate change can impact their access to homes, that's an important issue, right? So students might be coming in with wanting to make a difference in this way, but they're not seeing it reflected in the curriculum. For the second dimension, at the institutional level, thinking about identity-conscious forms of instructional practices. And so oftentimes in STEM, you might see things framed from a really binary perspective. So when you think about atoms bonding, or you think in science, right, or chemistry, or when you think about ordered pairs in mathematics, oftentimes if you're coming in with a cis heteronormative frame, you might think about framing some of these topics that have a binary feel to them with invoking cis heterosexual relationships as a metaphor to help students to make sense of this. But in doing some of that, you're creating opportunities for students to really disconnect from their learning experience. They're not able to kind of connect with that particular metaphor, right? Or when you think about scientific thought, when we conceptualize biological sex as being explicitly, 2 X chromosomes or an XY chromosome, we're erasing intersex experiences. When you have notions of, rhetoric in the sciences that there's only 2 genders according to biological thought, there's already something ingrained in the nature of these disciplines that are already reinforcing forms of transphobia and forms of cis heteropatriarchy. And so how are we thinking about the instructional moves that we make to be able to disrupt some of that? In relation to the intersections with race, how are you thinking, oftentimes in STEM classrooms, instructors will incorporate research for students to engage in, which is wonderful. But many times these research opportunities are framed from statistical and experimental designs that are trying to achieve claims of generalizability that are oftentimes really reinforcing white, cis, normed forms of experiences, but then claiming to generalize to all populations. And so what ends up happening is queer and trans of color experiences get marginalized and positioned as aberrant or different, right? And so how are we supporting students to be able to look at research and think about, do you see yourself in this research? Can you bring a critical lens to this research and really begin to think about, are these claims actually generalizable? And so helping your students to be able to kind of engage critically with their existing body of work can help them to have voice to elevate their own intersectional perspectives in relation to these bodies of inquiry. I highlight Dr. Benjamin's Ida B. Wells Just Data Lab that explores issues around race, justice, and technology. So, in some of Benjamin's work, really thinking about how there are neutral forms of algorithms in healthcare that oftentimes don't account for broader structural realities of oppression. Dorothy Roberts' work that I'm citing here kind of talks about the ways in which forms of reproductive injustices for queer women of color and for women of color more broadly are oftentimes tied to the ways in which eugenics are still inscribed in the ways in which we design genetic technologies. And so how are those opportunities being engaged in our classroom spaces? And oftentimes in pre-professional STEM fields, so like the healthcare or engineering, we oftentimes might have students come and present, and we might have expectations around professional forms of dress that might be latent again with white, cis, het normed frames of thinking about what is considered to be professional forms of attire, what is considered to be professional forms of styling your hair, for example, right? And so also about ways in which you might take up space or participate in the classroom. Are certain forms of gender expression more allowed to be considered what's true forms of learning? What does learning actually look like in your STEM space? And then for my final dimension here, tied to my framework around thinking about disrupting white cis heteropatriarchy in relation to pedagogical practices, is the relational piece. And so how are you building relationships through pedagogy? So, how are we thinking about the ways in which we can disrupt, in my work, thinking about disrupting the ideas of asociality, right? This depersonalized field that STEM education might have, to be able to find ways to be able to connect meaningfully with students, where students kind of think about how their social selves is actually a relevant form of experience within these particular spaces. And so I highlight some examples of different practices that I've seen done in STEM classroom spaces where it creates that space for relationship building. Having students submit a small brief STEM autobiography, which I similarly do in my research, but this could be done in the classroom as well, where you get to know students by virtues of their stories in a relation to STEM. Maybe you might have a 1-minute paper in class, or in the ways in which you engage with students if it's outside of the classroom, where they get to share a little bit more about who they are, to have a more holistic view of their perspectives. If you know students are using certain pronouns or names, or recently changed their names, which might be different from the rosters that are provided to you at your institution, acknowledging that and engaging in that is so important to be able to help students to feel connected to your instruction and feel seen. And lastly, oftentimes when we have collaborative learning, we oftentimes kind of admire opportunities for students to be able to work collaboratively, but we also know that there might be some tensions, right? The heightened risk of kind of engaging socially with engaging your own identities or even disclosing aspects of your identities. And so I think about, I'm a math educator, so I oftentimes think about small group learning opportunities where we try to mitigate status to be able to kind of disrupt ways in which we might reinforce who gets to take up space in collaborative learning. So we co-construct norms with students to disrupt some of that status building, going back to my very first slide about those hierarchies of who's considered able and competent. And that actually begins to alleviate ways in which students can actually find them social selves to be brought into those collaborative learning environments, because the instructor or the educator has already attended to some of these issues. And when you think about how being in a STEM space, it's inscribed with neutrality, there's that heightened risk of, can I engage this? Can I bring this into the space? Because it's already been told to me that it's not relevant or that it's too personal, for example. So to conclude, I leave you with three thoughts. So in doing this, it has to be deep and sustained ways of engaging in these pedagogical practices. We have to kind of go beyond like tips and tricks or piecemeal ways of kind of engaging in disrupting forms of white cis heteropatriarchy through our practices. So we have to kind of sustain this through our time with our students. We have to be able to, this is self-work too. How do you kind of critically interrogate? So when I opened my talk today, I talked about the ways in which I'm positioned in relation to areas of privilege and oppression and how I have to constantly interrogate that in relation to my research. So this is something that educators have to do as well. How are you decentering yourself in relation to be able to do this justice work? Professional development opportunities, we have to actually value this stuff. So if this doesn't exist already in educational spaces where it might be deemed as not necessarily relevant or important, we have to value professional development to interrogate the ways in which our practices, while being well-intended, may still have unintended consequences that reinforce forms of oppression. So what are ways in which departmental spaces or collective spaces in which you're in can be able to come together to help one another to work in solidarity to think through some of this stuff, right? And then lastly, building partnerships with communities and with organizations that are based around affinity, around identity. So thinking about like Out in STEM chapters, for example, or the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Education Network, who might have programmings in your local communities. What are ways in which we can build connections with those existing entities and existing bodies in a mutually collaborative way, mutually beneficial way, right? Because there is a risk of collaborating to be able to learn, but at the same time, how are those organizations and spaces also benefiting from collaborating with you to improve your practice? So how do we begin to build those partnerships in an authentic and mutually beneficial way? These are my references if you are interested. And this is my contact information. And I thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dr. Leyva. We would like to move on with the panel, and we have some experts here today that we're really delighted to bring to our in-person and our virtual audience. Our panel moderator is Dr. Kristen Witte, an exhibit content and research specialist at the Museum of Science and Industry. They discover and develop fascinating science stories within the museum's exhibits. The most recent work includes a COVID-19 centered exhibition called We Can Beat the Pandemic Together. In a previous life, they spent most of their time pipetting yeast cells in exchange for a PhD in cell biology from the University of Chicago. We also have Hontas Farmer. She currently teaches mathematics at the College of Dupage and astronomy at Elmhurst University. Her education path was non-traditional, proudly starting with Triton College, then transferring to Northern Illinois University for a BS in physics, and then to UIC for graduate level non-degree study where she learned general relativity and quantum field theory, to DePaul University for a Master of Science degree. Her research is in the area of gravitational wave physics, and she is a member of the Laser Interferometer Space Antenna Consortium. She previously served as a member of the Consumer Advisory Board of Howard Brown Health Center and then president of that same board. As a transgender woman of color, she has had to engage in survival sex work in the past and has also survived that life, one of the few scientists with her background. And Dr. Casey Xavier Hall earned his MPH in global health and a PhD in behavioral, social, and health education sciences at Emory University. He is a postdoctoral research fellow at the Institute for Sexual and Gender Minority Health and Well-Being and the Department of Medical Social Sciences at Northwestern University's Feinberg School of Medicine. Dr. Xavier Hall is also affiliated at FSU's Center for Population Sciences and Health Equity, and also his research utilizes mixed methods, approaches to examine health disparities in sexual health, violence, and substance use. His recent work includes understanding STEM engagement outcomes in sexual and gender minority adolescents and young adults, including the role of anti-LGBT bullying on STEM engagement and secondary students. Dr. Witte, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you. I thought that Luis's talk was quite good, hitting on a lot of really fantastic points. And looking at the questions, we have one for you, Luis, and I also want to extend it to the panelists as well, because you all have experience teaching. But so the question is, what are ways that you have made collaborative work among students more inclusive? And Luis, why don't we start with you to begin with?
Sure. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay. I think so. One thing that I'm thinking about I teach pre-service teachers in the elementary education programs here at Vanderbilt. And so one of the ways that we engage in some of this is through a perspective called complex instruction. And so the ways in which we support our pre-service teachers to think about how they create opportunities for students to work collaboratively is to think about taking a problem that's designed in a way that's actually not possible to be able to solve it on your own. So you actually have to have multiple people being able to partake in the problem solving process. And so then you have different roles that you can assign. This is not kind of like the traditional way of thinking about the note taker and the thinker and all that. They're actual mathematical roles, right? And so what ends up happening by virtue of the designs of those problems is you have to be able to kind of engage collaboratively and rely on one another, because all of those pieces will ultimately lead to the solution for that problem. And so for me, in my work as a teacher educator, I'm supporting future teachers and thinking about how might you design problem solving opportunities in these ways, because the way that it's already designed in that built-in way begins to really disrupt the ways in which we might rely on one student who might be coming from a racial majority group or a gender majority group in some way that already has some form of privilege in that space, and then therefore their voice gets heard and they have more airtime during the problem solving process. So I say that as one way that I've seen that in my work.
Nice. So sort of what I heard was a little bit, there's sort of like this leveling of roles, and that you're not defaulting to sort of predefined, socially constructed roles, and instead bringing that to the space through, as you described, these mathematical roles. And so Hontas, what sorts of ways do you engage this like collaborative inclusivity amongst your students?
Very similar to Dr. Leyva, I will assign lab projects that are too complicated to be done by yourself, to put it quite simply. Parts done online, and it's questions that they're supposed to answer individually, maybe multiple choice or essay, and then there's a paper that they write very formally using something we scientists call LaTeX. We use it to draft actual scientific papers, and then they're supposed to draft that paper together. At the end of class, they come up with a final project. It's worth like half the grade, where they devise the experiment. It's applying the astronomy they learned to something they're interested in. In math class, sometimes I have them do a mathematical project. If it's something like business math, then obviously a business problem is appropriate. Math class, it's a bit harder to make students collaborate, because in the end, we do want them to know how to solve the problems individually as well. So math is probably harder to do that with. With science, it's pretty natural, since science is inherently collaborative.
I guess what I would add to that is sort of been already mentioned in the keynote, which is positionality. I think is a and self-reflection is a huge piece. And those of us that do mixed methods research or qualitative research, we think about positionality all the time. We think about situating our own position in our research. But a lot of times in quantitative methods, we forget that piece, or we don't always introduce it. So in a statistics class, for example, you can introduce self-reflection and positionality, thinking about things like reference groups and statistic models, and just kind of laying that foundation even before you start doing group work can help sort of oil the gears, I guess, before you start the group work.
It's kind of hard to do that with basic plane geometry, though. You know, square is a square.
Oh, great. Those are fantastic answers. Okay, so I would like to, the next question is, and why don't we direct this to you. I think that you would have the best answer for this to begin with. Ready? Okay. What do we know about how negative experiences such as bullying in middle and high school, which is disproportionately experienced by queer, non-binary, trans youth, impact engagement in STEM education and future careers?
Yes, so I can't speak on this because we've just finished some forthcoming analyses on this topic area among a national sample in the US. And essentially, the answer is not positive. We see that for our study, we had a sort of a general measure for bullying, which means it was just bullying in the high school setting in general. And we found that it's detrimental to how LGBT students feel in the classroom. It also is detrimental to how LGBT students, secondary students specifically, view STEM fields as being welcoming to transgender or LGBT individuals specifically. And also we find that the way that LGBT secondary students feel in the classroom and feel about the STEM field more broadly leads to lower intent if they find those things to be negative. So for example, if a student sees the field as being not supportive of trans individuals and they themselves are trans, they may not engage in STEM themselves. It's unsurprising, but it is something that hasn't been seen in the data as much. We haven't seen a lot of studies examining individuals' experiences, particularly secondary students, in terms of STEM particularly. There is broader field in terms of education overall for secondary students, but we don't see as many studies focusing on STEM.
I do have an experience about this, but it might not be the kind of thing you would assume. Years ago in Chicago, there was a proposal to have a school just for LGBT students, and that was proposed as being a solution to bullying, to take the LGBT students and put them in their own school. And the people behind it had good intentions, but they intended for the school to be focused mostly on arts, performing arts, things like that, creative arts. And I showed up to object based on the fact that it would be ghettoizing ourselves to say we can only do this thing. So I think we should also own the fact that there can be self-stereotyping. If you're LGBT, you can stereotype yourself into only doing these certain things. You can say, this isn't for me because I'm Black and I'm trans, or I'm a woman, or I'm of a religion or ethnicity that for its size hasn't had so many Nobel Prize winners, but invented algebra. You know, there are so many reasons people can pigeonhole themselves, and we have to own that as well. So there is an element of personal responsibility in all of it. Structures can keep you from going forward as fast, but you have to, as Neil Tyson once said, have a sort of self-refueling drive to keep going, no matter what the resistance. I talk so long, I'm sorry.
No, I thought that was a fantastic answer. So something that we think a lot about at the museum, actually, when we're developing exhibits, is how to go beyond just simply like representation of people, and how to actually sort of dismantle the structures that that lead to sort of like pigeonholing people outside of STEM to like the ones that also then like encourage them to leave STEM. And I'm back to Luis. I think that you had, oh, Luis is not up there. Hey, there you are. Back to you. I think that you had a lot of interesting ideas and thoughts around like what can we do besides representation? Like how do you actually start deconstructing the systems that reinforce these narratives?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the perspectives that I shared today, it's coming from a piece that I collaborated with Taylor McNeil and Antonio Duran. And one of the things that's a centerpiece for that article that we wrote together was the idea of neutrality. And so, and I mentioned this in the talk, that the ways in which neutrality in STEM gets used in a very insidious way of preserving violence, pedagogical forms of violence, right? So we just say, oh, well, it's not social, STEM is just STEM. And so when we think about like, well, we need more, we need to further diversify STEM, but STEM still is so problematic as a space. So we're finding ourselves of trying to increase persistence and retention and diversify, but we're trying to bring folks who are marginalized and oppressed in these different complex ways into a system that is dehumanizing and into a system that doesn't necessarily value their funds of knowledge and their perspectives and their experiences. And so we have to go beyond representation and increasing diversity, right? I think it's important to have representation, but we need to really begin to interrogate the broader structures. So, and by that I mean, my talk today was around pedagogy, and that's just one entry point around structures, right? And those pedagogies are entrenched in ideologies of how we've understood in really common sense ways of what is STEM. And I talk about STEM broadly, but there's so much variation within the STEM umbrella when you think about the disciplines of mathematics and engineering, biological sciences, right? And so, but all of these different disciplines under the STEM umbrella really kind of converge onto this idea of your social experiences it's not relevant. And so when you have communities that you're trying to bring in to diversify the space, but you're also in the position of telling folks who you are doesn't really count or matter, then whose perspectives are being centered, right? And so is it a matter of just further diversifying to bring folks into a space that is violent towards them? And so that's why we have to go again beyond just individual experiences and representation and really think about systemic and structural issues that are at play.
Yeah, I think that that is a fantastic point of how much STEM sort of caters itself to objectivity and creates this very like cis heteronormative way of being. And then so merely being queer within a STEM space actually illuminates these normative biases by just like existing in it. Casey, it looks like you have something to say.
Yeah, one thing I'd say about that is in science, you are usually expected to make your assumptions explicit. And I think that that's something that if we extend into the classroom and think about the assumptions that we have in the classroom and make those assumptions explicit in terms of our social sort of structure in the classroom, that can be a starting point to addressing that.
One issue I've wanted to point out is, and it's obvious to us here, but it might not be obvious to people who might see this on YouTube and make little clips of it. We're not talking about things like the purified product of STEM, the knowledge, right? For example, we're not saying that the fact that electrons fundamentally spin either up or down is cis heteropatriarchy. It's just fundamental particles doing their thing. What we're saying is the process of finding that knowledge where human beings have to work together and decide who gets a job and who gets funding and what student gets to go on the trip to Europe with the professor and what student gets a better recommendation letter. I've been told by a very supportive individual that if you're a woman, you need to have a recommendation letter that's that much better than a male's. I've been told by another very supportive individual that I was too different but not good enough to be that different and also get a recommendation from them. Wonderful person, but they were more afraid that other people in the field might be jerks. And so it's that type of thing that is really the issue of diversifying STEM. So to those of you out there in YouTube land and Twitter land, we're not talking about the facts. We're talking about the human, well, actually, the fact that we are human beings living in a society that's not necessarily willing to accept scientists who look different or think different.
Just to kind of jump off that point a little bit about the purified product of STEM. So like what emerges from the lab or whatever space, something that I do think though, sometimes it persists, especially through language, like and how results are actually communicated. There's this really fantastic example about, so I'm a biologist by training, and a lot of research in reproduction, where you have an egg and you have a sperm, so much of it is written in a way that the sperm is attacking the egg. The egg is a very just sort of like placid figure that's just being attacked by the sperm. And that is how it's written, even in the scientific literature. And that is patriarchy, just flat out. So there is still, even these systems continue in these products, even though they shouldn't, quote unquote. Go ahead.
Yeah, but sperm and egg are a lot more complex than fundamental particles. So that's really more of an emergent property of a complex system, right? Like, for example, the one I would really like to hear from you about, and everyone would, you're a cell biologist. They love saying, gender is a fact, X, Y, XX, and that's it. Like, can you tell us something about all the different genes that are involved that aren't on those chromosomes? Because I know there are others than just XX and XY, and there can be stuff that goes on with them that makes people intersex, or maybe even, according to some research, could even explain to some degree being queer.
So the question is, can I, as a biologist, speak to the genes that relate to sex and and the genetics of sex? Yeah, right. Would I? I think that I don't think I have necessarily any more to add than like what you said of, right? Like the genetics of sex are extremely complex, and there are ways that scientists, again, I'm speaking from a biologist's perspective, where we often are trying to reduce things to their component parts. And that is very much the canon of a lot of science. Not even limited to biology, like across, I would assume, physics as well. Yeah, and that sort of, and you said something very interesting about the emergence of like something emerging from complexity. Like it's really only in the new wave, like the very recent wave of academic science, that we're really taking into account complexity without trying to reduce to its component parts, which I would be curious then how that sort of new wave of thinking is actually then playing into the expansion of queerness into the space, into science space. Luis, maybe you have something to say about that.
Sure. Yeah, I really appreciated where the conversation went around the perspective that you shared about like reducing to its component parts, because that's been coming up in my work when students are talking about like being in engineering, and that's actually a common thing. And so oftentimes engineering should be used as a profession to be able to solve complex social problems, but the humanity that's tied to these things is often lost. And so while we're trying to really kind of boil things down to the individual parts that make up something, right, we kind of lose, I think this is kind of the point about emergence that was brought up in our conversation, right? Like, how are those things kind of working together, and how are we thinking about social context? I think this kind of gets to the point earlier that Dr. Farmer was mentioning about, like, the idea of like, it's not just about the electron spin and those facts, it's about the broader social realities of what's shaping how we're engaging with that scientific truth or that scientific phenomenon, right? And so I think we lose the sense of the broader context, the humanity of these things, while we're trying to behold ourselves to the values of these disciplines, which is to just unpack, find pieces, but not really think about how those pieces work together and how the social kind of aspects shapes how they work together or don't work together.
Nice. Yeah, that's a great thought. Everyone keeps laughing at me as I'm looking at the screen. Okay, so we have about 7 more minutes. And I think that for maybe our last-ish question, I would like to ask, starting with Casey, why don't we start with you? So how did each of us navigate the path we took personally? Because we're all sort of queer identified people in STEM. So what did it look like for us and how did we navigate it? If you want to go first, Casey.
Mine was a winding road, I would say. I won't go into all the details, but one aspect of my experience is I'm first generation college student. And so that really colored my experience. My undergraduate degree was actually in journalism and French language and race and cultural studies, which still relates a lot to the work that I do now because I'm a public health scientist. I'm in social sciences. But I did have like this debate with myself when I was a secondary student thinking about, we had to do this assignment that was like, what do you want to do for the rest of your life? Which you should ask a secondary student, absolutely. And I wrote mine about being an author and being a geneticist were like the two things that I kind of wrote about. And I remember thinking like being a geneticist just doesn't speak to my own. I didn't think about it in that way exactly, but I was thinking I don't want to be stuck in a lab like pipetting things that didn't seem to like speak to my social experience. And even though it was something I was very interested in, I was more drawn to these social spheres. And I eventually found public health, which was kind of this intersection between social spheres and these more hard sciences, allowed me kind of to dip into LGBT health and think about biology and disease at the same time. And so that was kind of my happy solution to make it work for me.
Well, for me, I think it really comes down to, I'm lucky that I was attracted to physics almost from the moment I knew I wanted to be some kind of a scientist. I was one of those kids everyone thought was a little professor and knew was going to be some kind of scientist. And when I was young, they'd say, "Oh, Hontas, you don't want to be a woman when you grow up. You're just sensitive and too smart for those kind of boxes." It was the 1980s, so I was like about as charitable as it got. I would say the thing about pure math and physics is while there are definitely ways we are oblivious to social issues when it comes to the human aspect, ultimately, as me and my department chairperson, an East Indian man, say, you can't affirmative action a wrong mathematical answer into a right one. Ultimately, if your field theory predicts what nature does, people can harumph about it. They can be bigoted towards you, but they have to acknowledge it works. If you say that you discovered a comet and you show them a picture of it, they have to be as ignorant as someone who sees a picture of it around Earth and still argues that it's flat in order to not believe it. So I'm kind of lucky that I chose science. I chose the science that gave everyone misconceptions about all of science in that respect. Like, I'm going to do something really dangerous for a physicist and compare myself to Einstein. His story is actually the archetype of people ignoring that sociological factors matter. He was undeniably brilliant as a student, but when they talk about why he could only get a job at the patent office, they mention, oh, maybe he didn't get such good grades, or he was kind of a jerk in class, that's why he didn't get letters. They forget he was a Jewish man in pre-World War II Europe which should be incredibly obvious. He got out of Germany just before the Nazis were able to put him in a concentration camp. That's the part of his story we could tell, and even that alone would probably open a lot of minds. He was an undeniably brilliant man in the supposedly most fundamental science, and he couldn't find a job because of bigotry. So if I'm certainly not Einstein, and I'm not, by no means, is it really so surprising if I have a little trouble finding a full-time tenure-track job or anything like that? You know, no, it isn't. It's actually quite expected. And it's not right that things have in some ways not changed since 1905. It's just changed who it's totally acceptable to exclude.
Yeah, definitely. Luis, your hidden photo. I can repeat the question.
Oh, I think, is it about our trajectories of being LGBTQ and pursuing STEM?
Yes, that is the question. Yep.
Sure. Yeah. So I was a mathematics major. And when I was kind of going through the major, I mean, the notion of it being kind of a social less experience was very much true in my own educational experience. And so I was eager to try to find and foster more strong social connections outside of my mathematics major, but I had a constant tug of war around my different identities. And so when I was in Latin affinity groups, I oftentimes kind of felt like my own form of gender expression or my own ways of constructing my masculinity was oftentimes removing me from being Latin enough in those spaces. And so then when I would kind of go into queer affinity spaces, the same kind of tug of war would happen in relation to kind of being one of the only people of color in those spaces. And so I kind of always had this sense of tension. And then, you know, growing up, my parents would always talk about, like, you know, they would say the phrase protege tu imagen, or like watch the ways in which you present yourself, which is a coded way of saying don't necessarily be your full self because that might discount some of your achievements academically or professionally. And so much of my experience as an undergraduate student was what inspired the work that I do in STEM living learning communities and programs, to be able to incorporate the social and the academic, but designing these spaces in an intersectional way. So students don't necessarily have to feel this tug of war around their identities, and also don't have to feel as though they have to kind of think about protegiendo su imágenes or managing the ways in which they're engaging their identity. They can be their unapologetic self in those spaces. And so my lived reality, I always grew up with that idea in my family of, like, I want those who come after me to be better than me. And so the work that I do is activist oriented to allow better opportunities for queer and trans folks of color coming after my time as an undergraduate student, and my time in higher education, so they do find forms of affirmation of their intersectional identities in these spaces.
Nice, that's great. We are at 7:01. Are there any last thoughts or questions amongst the panelists or anything at all? Well, I thought that this was a fantastic talk overall. I think that there's a lot to be said for just sort of queering STEM as a practice, not simply the inclusivity of queerness, but rather how to queer it. How can we actually dismantle the structures that lead to this sort of exclusionary practices that continue to persist? And I think that this has been a really enjoyable exploration of that. So thank you.
On behalf of everyone present this evening and our online audience, I cannot thank you enough. As a teacher, secondary and college teacher for 25 years or so, I really believe it's helpful that if you can see it, you can be it. And I think opening conversations like this and having resources and research like what Luis is doing is really critical. So Casey, Hontas, Kristen, thank you so much for joining us this evening. Luis, thank you for joining us. We still have 30 minutes in this room, some refreshments and more opportunity to dialogue if you're interested. Rowan and Aisha are going to come around with some evaluations because we very much value your feedback on this program so that we can effectively plan other programs in our Inclusiveness in STEM series at C2ST. And I also want to share that on the 16th of November, we will be doing a short talk virtually with Argonne National Lab. It's the 5th in our series of celebrating their 75th anniversary, and it will be with Dr. David Szapluski, and it's going to be talking about what's new with nano. Little bit of housekeeping. If you've learned something new today, by all means, please go to c2st2.cnf.io and share your feedback and your thoughts. If you're interested in learning more about C2ST, you can find us at www.c2st.org. And if you really had a good time, because it is that time of the year, feel free to make a donation to C2ST so we can support further programs like this. And the final note, thank you very much to Trevor for joining us, and thank you to Horizon for their support of this series as well. Please stick around and let's continue the conversation for a bit longer. Thank you.